Well, good afternoon. Chronicles. I think it will be accurate to say that this is one work of fiction which literally wrote itself, been writing itself, in fact, for quite a few decades. In other words, I'm saying that the themes which are engaged in that work have been with me, and I've been expressing them in various forms, in poetry, largely in polemics, even in plays, media polemics, of course, and conferences, both internally and outside. I recall, for instance, writing a long poem which was dedicated to the youths, the school pupils who were abducted by these religious extremists, the Chibok girls, and also, again, in connection with another abduction of school pupils, some of whom were released. No, in fact, all of them were offered release, but one of them, Leah, her name was Leah Sharibu, refused to convert as a condition of her release. Until today, we haven't heard a thing about Leah. Just as the 100 or so from Chibok have just vanished off the radar, completely out of sight. In other words, I've been agitating about just the now assignment of children to the war front, an undeclared war, but one which is so intense and is destroying the future generation, destroying our own children. Now, there's one thing I wouldn't say acceptable. I mean, there's nothing absolutely acceptable about watching your people, your relations, your friends being kidnapped and having to pay ransoms for their relief. No, but at least we adults, we are able to take it. Whenever the future becomes targeted, really becomes commodities, brings back memories, histories. The slave trade, for instance, it's like allowing the future generation to be sold once again into slavery. Very often, of course, sex slavery, especially where the girl child is involved. And this is of course the most dramatic and most lacerating aspect of the descent of a society, of a nation, into the abyss of inhumanity. So many other factors. The country which is fictionalized is literally on the brink. It's not just me saying this. Pick up the papers any day, and you wonder really whether you're still dealing with a community of humans or regressed humanity. And it's something which weighs heavily, I think, on many people. It's not just a question of being a writer. Many people just don't have means of articulating this. And so when I say that it is a work which literally wrote itself, I just mean like the average citizen, the average Nigerian citizen, has been weighing on us, testing our humanity, making us ask questions, in fact, about what is human. Now, I don't want to be too solemn about the work, especially as I've been told that it's funny in many parts. I'm actually relieved to hear that, because as long as one keeps one's sense of humor, I think one keeps at least a little section of one's humanity, and to be able to extract a light moment out of obvious tragedy. It means that many aspects of what makes us human are still alive and still resisting, albeit sometimes through what I call gallows humor. Chronicles have been with me for, as I said, many decades, but again, it's an indication of the kind of society, the kind of community that provoked this work. that I was incapable of tackling it while I remained within Nigeria, while I remained within the environment itself. I think it's a question of the reality constantly overweighing and overburdening the imagination. I mean, sometimes you can have too much of a good thing. Then the French call it embarras de richesse. Oh, what an ironic expression. There's nothing rich about that. It's all gloom. But you understand what I mean? An embarrassment of too much drama. And it sometimes cripples the imagination, cripples the recreative urge within one. And so I had to wait. When people say, why did it take you so long, so many decades before after the last novel? I never stopped writing, of course. Why did it take you so long? It's just because the novel form, which is not really one in which I'm most comfortable, it requires so much concentration, at least for me. And so I had to wait and ask when the event became just too much and I felt I had to set something down. I had to ask my friends, some of my former students, colleagues. I said, I need a retreat, which again was rather ironic because I used to run some kind of residency for writers, but of course that's no use to me in my own residency. So they didn't even take me seriously to start with. Eventually, however, I realized I really needed this space outside. And so the first colleague, young colleague, lent me his cottage in Yene, Senegal, by the sea, which is a totally change of environment. And for the first time, I really was able, for about 10 days, come to grips, and I was able to set things down, to set the whole thing in motion. It became surreal to me when it was a too short a period, and eventually I got yet another residency. This was in Ghana, in Aburi, which has certain sort of bittersweet memories for Nigerians. You know, Aburi was the, shall we say, the last chance saloon, I think it's called, for Nigeria at that time, before the Civil War. That's where the contesting people met and tried to straighten things out, to try and find a formula for the continuing existence of Nigeria without actually going to war. Well, it didn't work, but there I was. I never ever even went near the meeting chambers. I felt it would depress me too much since it didn't work out. So I just concentrated on my writing. And for another 8-10 days, I was able to set down again a sizable chunk. And after that, then it was a question of stolen time here, stolen time there, etc., until finally, Mr. Pandemic, COVID, stepped in and locked the world down. It's very unpleasant to say that one profited from a pandemic, from a global disaster, but well, this is exactly what happened. And I hope a number of other people are able to say the same thing, that at least they extracted something out of this global disaster, which is still very much with us. But then let me spend a few moments in also acknowledging certain threads which went into the creation, the articulation of this oppressive reality inside me. Many, many, many threads. Take, for instance, one, which is the novel by Ikweama called The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born. Ikweama's novel came to my mind over so many years, wondering when will the beautiful people be born? And of course, it was also a cautionary work, because I remember he came under severe criticism even among his colleagues, not just external critics. But I remember somebody like my late colleague, Chinua Achebe, actually going at this work, saying it was too negative, too gloomy. It was before the expression Afro-pessimism was invented. This was the sort of attitude, and I wonder what many people would say today of Ikweama's novel, The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born. But that work used to haunt me during all of that period when my own work was gestating. And perhaps it even nudged me unconsciously into ensuring that it wasn't, the work, it didn't come out, according to many opinions, too bleak, etc., etc. But at the same time, there are certain things impossible really to laugh about, such as the degradation of youth. We'll come back to that in a moment. Another work which came to my mind, and here we're talking about those realities that went into this novel. It was the work by Daniel Defoe, I beg your pardon, by Jonathan Swift, A Modest Proposal. I always mix those two writers up. I hope I've got it right this time. A Modest Proposal. And this was a kind of satire on cruelties being meted to children during a period that was supposed to be the European entitlements. And his modest proposal was very sardonic, Gallows type humor, but left a great impression on me over the years since my student days. And in this very satiric work, his proposal was, well, why waste children? Why waste cruelty? If you must be cruel to children, if you must destroy children, why don't you at least put them to good use, like cooking them and eating them? Well, that way at least we know you are not wasting nature, you're not wasting nature's gifts. And of course, that is a question which I've been asking myself, seeing to what use the new generation was being put, being directed, being destined. Because when you brutalize youth, you brutalize young people, I mean, it's like child abuse in the home. We all know that. We don't have to be psychologists to know what happens when children are abused. They grow up themselves abusing others in many instances. The lucky ones, of course, get over it. But consider what's been happening. Try and follow, for instance, the likely trajectory of the children of Chechnya. I'm speaking now of the Beslan, one of those most horrific events that should scar the conscience of humanity, the siege of Beslan, in which these children, school pupils, were dehumanized by so-called liberation fighters. They were made to drink their own urine. They were cooped up there. They were so desperate they drank their own urine. We saw photographs. We saw video. We saw this thing happening live, transmitted around the whole world. And when I looked at what's been happening to children, the kidnapping, I mean, the schools have now become the center of terrorism, no longer adults. Day after day, school children are being kidnapped. As I speak now, several hundred kidnapped from schools are still in captivity, with the government negotiating, religious leaders, some with courage, actually moving into forests to bargain, to negotiate, to plead with these kidnappers, who say, some of them say they are doing the will of God, of Allah. Others are at least even more honest. They're kidnapping for ransom. They feel that the nation's wealth is not reaching them. And so they feel that the best way of doing this, of getting their own share, is to strike society at its most vulnerable. And so with that, with all these various factors, and of course, I only mentioned two among maybe 20 coming into play in one's creative mind, my mind just moved on towards, well, if this is the way we're treating one another, in which casual killings just take every day, sometimes killings to ritual, very often we hear about that, sometimes just for money, and at the taking the brunt these days is the young generation. So my mind veered towards that modest proposal in which that satirist said, well, why waste humanity? Eat them, eat humans, and then at least we know somebody's benefiting somewhere. Somebody's anatomy is being enhanced in some way. Some people actually believe, and it's becoming commonplace. It's no longer an aberration. I must say this, all societies create their own aberrations. They have their own aberrations. I think the United States has a record, for instance, of one cannibal who actually captured his victims and ate them. I think France also had a notorious case not so long ago. Or was it that the kidnapper and cannibal moved from one to anyway? The important thing is this, that all societies have their aberrants. They have their quarters, their cause of abomination. We know that. But I've watched this become, I mean, you talk about new norm vis-a-vis COVID, but a degradation new norm has been going on in my society. That is the truth. Pick up the papers any day. And so you have a situation where you begin to ask the question, what is normal? And from that, what is human? Are there any taboos left in my society? Are there really any barriers where we say so far and no further? This is how that work came about. And I suppose being locked up with myself, I call the system RORO, roll on, roll off. For months, bed, table, work desk, dining table, back to bed, back to a masochistic existence, which I think more writers undergo than they care to admit. This really is a background to Chronicles. It's an attempt to tell my own society, look what you have become. Was it like this when you were children, like these ones now being kidnapped and traumatized and made to do heaven knows what abominations? And the thought also that we're actually traumatizing not merely those children who've been kidnapped, but the others. I should add that on my birthday, there's a kind of ritual among those who celebrate. I don't celebrate my birthday, unfortunately for me. Others do, and I'm compelled to join in once or twice. And one thing which I agree to every year is that I meet children. They come and visit me. And the last two sessions with those children, when they ask questions, it's been, we're afraid. Are we next? Is this the future? Do we just wait to be kidnapped? The fear is so palpable in their faces. Reminded me also when I went to Colombia, Colombia underwent, as you know, this period, maybe still undergoing it, this period of intense insurrection with FARC, in which the government resorted to actually relocating entire villages. We became protected villages, tried to create a semblance of normal life in those villages, and they became communities in themselves. And I still have with me a poem called El Mi Miedo, which is presented to me by one of the Colombian school children. It's a very moving event, by the way. If we had more time, I will tell you what a thrill it was to see Yoruba culture in Colombia, but that's by the way. All this coming to creativity. And this girl presented me with a poem which I've never forgotten, in Miedo, My Fear, My Fear. And it's this fear of her life being once again interrupted. It still remained with her, even though she was in a protected area. It's a dilemma, I recognize, and very often one even pities one's government. Not exculpate, not sympathize with, but just pities. Because there are certain decisions which are very hard to take for anybody, not just governments. If you want to defeat this level of terrorism, what do? What are you prepared really to sacrifice? To put it bluntly, do you pay ransom, knowing very well that the ransom will only go to the purchase of more arms, more capability for abductions? Maybe soon, maybe we'll witness even the kindergartens, the children, not just now youths, but infants being targeted. What's the next step? Recently, one of the terror groups, the bandits, we call them sometimes, brought down an Air Force plane. And that brings me to an appeal which I wish to make to our brothers and sisters overseas in the diaspora. There's hardly any government which does not consult, sooner or later, the intellectual caucuses. It doesn't mean that they take their advice, but we know that they try to reach into the intellectual caucuses. And from time to time, I'm afraid some of our brothers and sisters, I'm talking about Blacks, the African Americans, they misread the situation in Nigeria and they back the wrong horse or they offer the wrong advice. I read just a few days ago that the American government is about to cancel the sale of attack helicopters to the government in Nigeria for seemingly laudable reasons, that the human rights record of the government is not something to write home about. We criticize all the time. We're at the throats of the government over this. But there must be some nuancing when it comes to supporting governments with dubious records. I mean, there's no record of any government in Africa, for instance, using attack helicopters against the citizens, as far as I'm aware. There's certain kind of weaponry which can only be used against the kind of enemy I've been talking about, these murderous bandits and herdsmen and so-called religious fundamentalists and so on. And I think that some nuances just has to take place, because in the end, I wonder when access to weaponry is denied, which is so crucial, so essential to, safeguarding the citizenry. I think one must be careful to ensure that it is not the victims who are being further victimized. And because of that, I wish to remind colleagues here, intellectual colleagues, which librarians are, of a similar situation some years ago when I was compelled to take up our colleagues here because of the kind of advice which they were giving the government at the time, when the government wanted to proscribe, to declare Boko Haram as a terrorist organization. And to our distress, our astonishment and distress, we found a caucus of intellectuals protesting this, and for reasons which were, to me, very arcane. Here's just an excerpt. I'll read this out. An excerpt from the letter which they wrote to the government at that time. I quote, As scholars with a special interest in Nigeria and broad expertise on African politics, we're writing to urge that you not designate Boko Haram a foreign terrorist organization, FTO, in Nigeria. We are acutely aware of the horrific violence perpetrated by Boko Haram, including attacks on both Muslims and Christians in Nigeria, whether government officials or civilian targets. We share your concerns about the impact of extremist violence on Nigeria's democratic progress and security in general. However, an FTO designation would internationalize Boko Haram, legitimize abuses by Nigerian security services, and limit the state from limit the state department's latitude in shaping long-term strategy and undermine the US government's ability to receive effective, independent analysis from the region. That is a very dangerous attitude to take. And I hope our colleagues learn from the lesson of Boko Haram, who now have constituted themselves as the greatest enemies of Nigeria's future generation. Boko Haram, the Meeti Allah, the herdsmen, murderous herdsmen, who even killed more than Boko Haram, the bandits, etc., etc. All these people must be defeated. They must be defeated one way or the other. We know that's not the responsibility of external governments, to come to the aid. But when at least government presents plausible requests for the defeat of enemies of humanity, I would like our colleagues to please remember what the position they took in terms of Boko Haram 10 years ago, position that is still plaguing Nigeria today. We need a lot more dialogue, that's what I'm saying, and maybe a few more novels like Chronicles. I am now doing my promo. In all seriousness, now we need dialogue really between our people in the diaspora, serious, consistent dialogue, so that we can actually brief you about what is happening. Forget government propaganda, forget their self-interest, forget for a moment, in crisis like this, even for the moment, corruption. It's me saying that to us, so that's heavy word from my mouth. Forget even that for the moment, and look at a nation on the abyss, on the brink, a nation disintegrating as manifested by movements, secessionist movements from north to south. Look at the degradation of our future generation and decide what are the priorities. We are just writers. We'll continue to present the truth as we see it, to interpret the realities, and to slyly propose the possibilities of remedial action. Above all, please remember that we consider you part of us. We see, yes, you're African Americans, you're Jamaicans, you're Cubans, etc., but you're part of the African family. And you should liaise closer, much, much closer with the forebears, never mind their crime in selling you across the Atlantic. That was a long time ago.